Guardian of the Wolf, a Lords of the Stars novella by Matthias von Schantz.
Chapter 1. Blackout. August 27th, 2803 AD. Sunguard Headquarters, Europa, Jupiter, Solaris System.
Millertown Control, come in. Millertown Control, please respond. There was only silence. Colonel Reynolds was disappointed, though not surprised. The indicator light on the communications board before him showed there was no handshake. Radio communication through hyperspace was, of course, entirely digital. In both directions, you continuously sent packets, each containing a fraction of a second of encoded audio protected by error correction codes. And you received acknowledgement frames in return. Whether you spoke or not was irrelevant. The packets were still sent and the receipts still returned, even if all you transmitted was silence. That way, you knew the channel was always open and ready to be used. Except it wasn't. 3 minutes ago, the handshake had been lost, and digital transmission to Eta Boetes was no longer possible. Still, it wouldn't do to lose contact with a Terran colony because of a technical glitch. Redundancies were always built into the systems, and if the digital handshake failed, there was always an analog backup available. It wasn't encrypted, and it was susceptible to noise and degradation, but for emergency purposes, it was perfectly adequate. New Caribbean Control, Millertown Base, please come in. Silence still reigned supreme. Colonel Kelile Reynolds sighed, then leaned forward toward the technicians seated at the comm station before him. Try the special agent in charge. The two junior officers glanced back at him. One of them, a small Kalar woman in her early 20s, nodded and switched channels. Special Agent Mian Lame, please respond. NL27, please come in. Still nothing.
That was significantly more concerning, Colonel Reynolds thought. What he and everyone else had initially assumed was just a technical glitch now filled him with dread. It was easy enough to imagine plausible scenarios for why a remote colony world, 37 light-years away in the rough direction of the galactic east, might momentarily lose contact with the Terran Federation. Perhaps a power outage had shut down the transceivers, or some natural disaster had damaged the communications infrastructure. New Caribbean was tectonically active, and earthquakes or volcanic eruptions weren't unheard of. Colonel Reynolds didn't really consider the lack of response from the special agent an issue, not on its own. Whether they wished to communicate or not was their prerogative. It wouldn't have been the first time Special Agent Lamy had gone incommunicado, and you didn't question the decisions of a special agent. With genetic loyalty to the Terran Federation hard-coded during manufacturing, they were implicitly trusted to operate entirely at their own discretion. But two entirely separate communication channels failing at the same time? That was concerning indeed. If something had happened to the colony, one would think the special agent in charge of it would be more inclined to talk to Sunguard headquarters, not less. Which meant whatever disaster had struck New Caribbean was serious enough to have taken their special agent offline as well. And that thought scared Colonel Reynolds to the bone. Because as far as he knew, short of Project 47 or a nuclear detonation to the chest, there wasn't really anything man-made out there that should be dangerous enough to kill a Sunguard special agent. Perhaps he allowed his imagination to run wild, but if you were to discard those two scenarios, there were precious few events that could take out both a well-established colony and a biotic special agent at the same time, and most of them were literally astronomical in scale.
All right, he said, trying to stay calm, despite the seriousness of the situation.
Surely there was a natural explanation for what had just transpired out there at the edge of the sphere of space controlled by the Terran Federation. An explanation that was less extreme than the scenarios his imagination spun in his mind. It was time to think outside the box. "All right," he repeated, trying to buy himself time to think. "Contact Aphrodite." "Yes, sir," the Kelile technician replied quickly, with a soft lisp slipping between her hard lips. The Kelile were always eager to serve the Terran Federation, always ready to do their part for the Sunguard. Her small blue fingers flew quickly over the keyboard. The scales on her digits rasped faintly as they rubbed against each other. Moments later, the handshake indicator lit up as communications were established with the Sunguard base at Procyon. "Aphrodite Command," Colonel Reynolds said into thin air. The intelligent computer running the communication central would pick up his words and filter them out from the noise of the room before transmitting them across the hyperspace link to Lion base at Aphrodite.
"Be advised," he continued, "we have encountered a communications issue with Millertown Base, Eta Beauties 4. Repeated attempts have failed to re-establish the link, including attempts to reach the special agent on site. We're requesting your assistance to confirm our findings." "Yes, sir," the duty officer replied across the light years. "Give us a few seconds and we'll get back to you." The Sunguard officer on Aphrodite kept true to her word. Less than a minute later, the reply came in the form of the crisp voice of Colonel Singh, the communications liaison officer for Lion base, now replacing his subordinate. But to Colonel Reynolds, those seconds seemed to stretch into hours. And when the reply finally came, his heart sank.
"I trust you verified the issue isn't on our side." General Tellerk squinted as she looked at him across the desk, her black fur rippling as her facial muscles contracted. From their places on her collar, the emblems of the Sunguard, the grinning black wolf's head over a burning solar disk, greeted him with their comforting presence. "Of course, ma'am," Colonel Reynolds replied, glad he had thought to do so before escalating the issue. "Aphrodite Command confirms our findings. We appear to have simultaneously lost our links to both Millertown Base and Special Agent NL-27.
She looked down at the tablet he had provided her, scrawling through the briefing document without so much as a word. When she finally looked up again, he could see on her face that she now shared his deepest fears. It would, however, turn out that she did so for entirely different reasons. "I notice in your report you focused on astronomical explanations, an extreme solar flare event or an asteroid impact. Both would certainly be powerful enough to cause the loss of the colony and could possibly even lead to the total shutdown of a special agent." "I don't consider the asteroid hypothesis likely," he replied, careful not to seem as though he were contradicting his superior. But they didn't have time to focus on a hypothesis he had already discarded. General Tellerk agreed. "No, that would be highly unusual. Any asteroid or comet large enough to pose a threat would be tracked closely by their mass detectors. They'd have known about it days in advance at worst. It's inconceivable that they wouldn't have told us if that had been the case." "Eta Boötes is a subgiant," he chimed in. "It's a main sequence star, but it's old and now expanding. It's not violent, but it's considerably more chaotic than Solaris or Tau Ceti. Strong solar flares are common. If one were to happen at the wrong time, the mass ejection could potentially fry the electronics of the entire colony, or worse still, incinerate it." The general nodded. As a Juresian, she would have shaken her head affirmatively, but she had learned the Terran mannerisms and had, with considerable effort, adopted them as her own. It made social interactions in the rigid military structure of the Sunguard smoother.
"It's not an ideal colony world, I give you that," she said. "The climate's good,
then there's an abundance of life and resources there, but its sun is certainly a problem. We don't usually colonize stars near the end of their lives. Too unstable. But given Nova Solaris, I can understand why you sent your people there anyway." Colonel Reynolds nodded, almost imperceptibly. Those two words had hung as a spectre over the Terran race for 4 centuries now. The certainty that they would lose their sun had driven the second expansion, claiming worlds they would otherwise have ignored as their own. "It's also quite far away," she continued. "Not the furthest of the colony worlds, of course, but it's still twice the distance of the worlds we settled during the first expansion. The nearest Sunguard base would be Arcturus, right?" He confirmed her assessment. Mandela Base was just a little over 3 light-years away. As bases went, it wasn't prominent, nothing like von der Leyen, and certainly not like headquarters. Still, it was large enough to have several Sunguard armies stationed there. "We could have a rescue expedition mounted and ready to go within days from Mandela." For a moment, General Tlerk didn't say anything. When she did, her voice carried a faint undertone of sorrow.
"I can't authorize that, Colonel Reynolds. I don't mean to be insensitive to your people's needs, but sending in a fleet large enough to evacuate 100,000 citizens without knowing first what has happened there would not be prudent. It could be something other than a flare. For all we know, what will befall Solaris in half a century could have happened to Eta Boötes too. I can't allow a Sunguard army to jump into an ongoing Nova event if that's the case." She wasn't wrong, of course. He knew that. But her refusal put the Sunguard into an impossible situation. If it was too dangerous to send in ships to investigate what had happened there, they would have to wait until the light from a potential stellar event reached Arcturus to determine the cause. By the time the Sunguard observatories in orbit there could collect spectral emissions from the distant star, 3 years would have passed. 3 years that would render any rescue attempt meaningless. But discussions about astrophysics aside, Colonel Reynolds, there's another possibility we haven't talked about yet, one I find far more terrifying. She clasped her fingers together as she leaned forward toward him. "What if," she asked, "this was not a natural event?"
He had considered it, of course. Perhaps Special Agent Lammy had simply ordered Millertown Base to shut down communications for the time being. If that were the case, everything was in order. Whatever the Special Agent did was by definition in the best interest of the Terran Federation, and if he had shut down the comm systems, he obviously had had a good reason for doing so. If so, everything was as it should be, and he could be trusted to reactivate them again when the time was right. "It could be deliberate, yes," Colonel Reynolds admitted, "but we can't know that. I don't want to assume a best-case scenario and get caught with my pants down, so to speak." General Tlerk glared at him, though something in her eyes suggested her annoyance at his choice of words was more form than true irritation. Had they been sitting in a bar downtown instead of in an office at Sunguard headquarters, she probably would have laughed. "No, I don't mean that," she corrected him. "If it's a deliberate act on his part, fine, that's great. But you're right, we can't assume that. It's our job to identify situations like these and handle them before they become problems." She paused for a moment before continuing. "What's the closest indigenous people to Eta Boötes?" It was a rhetorical question, but he answered it nevertheless. "The Sonmai." "The Sonmai," she repeated, nodding slowly. The little furry, 6-legged creatures had always creeped him out. Something about their movements made him think of slithering snakes, or perhaps spiders, and not the paramammals they truly were. Still, he had to remain professional and not let his personal revulsion for them cloud his judgment.
"Pax Lupi has reigned supreme for 6 centuries, he eventually said. I have a hard time imagining any of the races assimilated during the second expansion would dare mount an attack on the Terran Federation. They might not have known us for long, but they know us well." "So does Jer," the general countered,
and Jur has been a member for all 6 of those centuries, yet my people are still waging a war of terror on the Federation. Knowing we will crush any insurgencies is by no means a guarantee they will not bloom. Remember that the new races have even less rights than my people." It was a sensitive issue, and he didn't press it further, but in the end General Tellerk agreed with him. "I don't think the Sonma have the psychology to initiate an insurrection," she concluded. "They've never shown a propensity for violence. They're shrewd, yes, but they tend to take advantage of their adversaries in monetary terms, not military. But there's a far more serious possibility, I think. Sometimes you needed a little help to think outside the box. The Sunguard was the military and police of the Terran Federation. Its role was to protect the interstellar state from threats, both from within and from without. But after 6 centuries of peace, successfully enforced across known space by the armies of the Sunguard and by its artificial soldiers, the biotic special agents, it was all too easy to fall into the trap of thinking only of threats from within. Eta Biotes is located at the outer edge of the Terran Federation sphere of interest, he said as realization dawned on him. Someone could be out there. Someone hostile. Someone else.
Chapter 2. Giant. In the vacuum of space, the small Sunguard scout ship descended in complete silence toward the frozen surface of Europa. It wasn't exactly sleek or beautiful, but at least it wasn't quite as boxy as the larger Sunguard war cruisers parked on the nearby landing field, Colonel Reynolds thought. Not that its form affected its functionality, but the bulky monstrosities the Terran Federation used for traveling between the stars had always irked him. Someday, surely, function would no longer be the only parameter considered when designing starships. As the vessel descended, a feeble ray from the distant sun suddenly reflected off its hull and glinted as it passed over the Sunguard emblem on its side. Other than the yellow and red of that solar icon and a handful of multicolored designations splattered across the ship's surfaces, the craft was painted a dull gray with only the slightest trace of beige in its pigmentation. Together with General Tellerk and a handful of support personnel, he stood waiting at the entrance to the landing field, clad in full spacesuits. The bulky orange garments that protected them from the lethal combination of temperatures that never rose above 100 Kelvin, the high-energy particles trapped in Jupiter's radiation belt, and, of course, the hard vacuum itself were a necessary evil. Out here, you either dressed for the occasion or you died, quickly and painfully. The door to the scout ship opened in eerie silence. In the frigid vacuum, a bare hand gripped the frame as the pilot emerged from the shadows within the vessel. Its operator, a woman in her early 30s, wearing nothing more than a gray jumpsuit with red stripes along its sides, stepped out into the cold and walked across the landing field, her tall black boots leaving impeccable prints in the dusty snow that covered the surface. In the low gravity, and without any atmosphere to act as a friction buffer, her long ginger copper-red hair danced impossibly with every step she took. As Colonel Reynolds watched, her face became covered with a fine layer of ice as the moisture in the air escaping from the airlock crystallized on her skin, obscuring the faint freckles he had seen there when she first emerged from the door. The ice didn't bother her, nor did the vacuum or the radiation. When she spoke, her lips didn't move. Instead, sound was synthesized directly from her thoughts and broadcast into the comm system of their spacesuits.
"Good morning," she said, her voice bright and friendly. "Why don't we take this inside?" General Tellerk cleared her throat. "What did you find, ma'am?" The special agent turned to look at her. "I'm sure you good people don't want to stay out here any longer than necessary.
There's no hurry. Let's go inside before we talk." No hurry. Those two words once more filled Colonel Reynolds with dread. Whatever had happened on New Caribbean was apparently already over, and nothing they could do now would change the situation there for the better. Once the airlock next to the landing field had cycled to even out the pressure, he removed his white helmet and shook his head slightly, as if that might help him clear his thoughts. The air smelled faintly of metal, but he was quite certain that the headache beginning to form behind his temples had nothing whatsoever to do with his recent spacewalk. Sending an evacuation fleet to Eta Bootes without knowing the cause of the problem had been out of the question. He fully understood the general's reasoning in that regard. But sending a single scout ship had still been deemed viable, and given the stakes, assigning a special agent had been the only reasonable choice for the crew. Whatever had happened out there was likely either too dangerous to be handled by a biological agent, or it would require decisions to be made on the spot that only a special agent had the authority to make. So, the call had gone out, a suggestion that a Sunguard Special Agent should travel to New Caribbean to investigate the calamity that had befallen the colony there, and Special Agent Ellie McBrien had volunteered for the mission that, over the course of 3 days, had taken her to the far side of the Terran Federation and back again. They gathered in a small conference room on the 3rd floor, with large windows overlooking the frozen plains outside. High in the sky, covering a significant fraction of the black emptiness above, hung the mottled brown disk of Jupiter, like a giant eye keeping constant watch over them. After treating himself to a cinnamon roll and a large cup of coffee from the pastries table in the corner, Colonel Reynolds sat down at the center of the rectangular black table that dominated the room. Next to him sat General Talek, her green uniform heavy with medals and ribbons. On the opposite side, Special Agent McBrien pulled out a metal chair and sat down, her legs crossed as she leaned back with a soft sigh, clearly enjoying her own role.
To the untrained eye, she looked like any ordinary woman. No one would ever suspect she was anything more than her meek appearance suggested. Yet Colonel Reynolds was always struck with awe whenever he reminded himself of her immense age. If you were to draw a timeline on a piece of paper and mark down select historical events on it, together with her day of birth, the date when the young woman facing him had been taken online would be closer to the French Revolution than to the present day. No one said a word. If the special agent's appearance was underwhelming, her presence was not. She dominated the room completely, and no one would even have dreamed of breaking the spell she held over them, not until she spoke first. "The Terran Federation colony on New Caribbean is gone, General," she finally said, directing her statement at the senior officer present. There was no "I regret to inform you" to be found in that sentence, Colonel Reynolds noticed, a trace of annoyance creeping up his spine. The woman had just delivered the news that 100,000 citizens of the Terran Federation were gone without so much as saying she was sorry. No, not annoyance. What he felt when he heard her statement was something else, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. There was a discrepancy there, but he couldn't yet shape it into a thought. Suspicion. No, that was too strong a word, and besides, it wasn't one you would ever use when speaking of a Sunguard Special Agent. Because whatever he might think about her, she wasn't cold, she wasn't uncaring. The green eyes that seemed to look into his soul from across the table held deep, genuine sympathy for the people around her. And yet, the loss of the inhabitants of New Caribbean didn't seem to faze her in the slightest. "You will begin the process of writing off the colony immediately," she ordered General Talek. "Reclaiming the colony is not worth the effort, and not in the best interest of the people of the Terran Federation. There are hundreds of other worlds out there that would serve the evacuation effort better. There is no need to return to Eta Botes. The system is henceforth off-limits to the Sunguard. Yes, ma'am, General Taluk replied immediately. There was no how, no why, no but in her response. With military precision, the general obeyed the order her superior had given her. Anything else would, of course, have been unthinkable. She would never question the special agent.
He could stay silent no longer. "Ma'am," he said, carefully considering how to phrase his question so as not to get himself into more trouble than necessary. "I mean no disrespect, but could you please tell us what happened at Eta Boetes?" There, he had asked the question the general would never dare to voice. If the special agent didn't volunteer the information, no one else would ever ask it of her, and the knowledge of what had transpired on New Caribbean would forever remain buried in her memories. Special Agent McBrien turned her head to look at him. Her long red hair fell over her shoulder as she did so. "The colony has been destroyed, Colonel Reynolds," she replied softly. "There is nothing left for you there, and the Sunguard has lost Special Agent Muan Lamy." He nodded politely. It didn't really matter that he wanted to continue his line of questioning. If the special agent didn't wish to tell him, there was nothing more he could do to force the issue. If the events at the colony had to be kept secret by her, it was for a good reason. And besides, the none too subtle elbow he felt in his side made it clear that General Taluk wouldn't tolerate any further insubordination from him in this regard anyway.
Frustrated by his own inability to question the special agent, he eventually decided to let the issue go, for now. While it grated on him that he would get no answers from her, he was honest enough to admit he wasn't being completely fair. Had she been an admiral sitting in that same chair, wearing an admiral's white uniform and golden medals, he wouldn't even have thought to question her orders. But here she was, seemingly just a young girl, wearing a simple jumpsuit without even the slightest hint of decorations or rank to elevate her importance, and he instinctively fell into the trap of feeling he was her superior, when in reality it was, in every way imaginable, the other way around. She would be the one giving orders to the admirals. Had she been a biological agent, the level of trust the Terran Federation had placed in her and in her brothers and sisters would have been unwise, to say the least. But with their genetic loyalty, it was another matter entirely. For 600 years, that trust had been validated time and again as the special agents went about their business as the vanguard of humanity. Not once during those centuries had they strayed from their path, and never had Solar Command had any reason to regret the authority it had vested in its biotic creations. To be honest, Colonel Reynolds had to admit that not giving them free rein would have been the immoral choice, not to mention an immense waste of resources. And yet, he didn't trust the woman.
"You are dismissed," Special Agent McBrien told them. He began to rise from his chair, but the grey-clad woman motioned with her hand for him to sit down again. She smiled at him. "I would appreciate it if you could stay, Colonel Reynolds." General Taluk, together with the support personnel, stood and left the room, leaving the two of them alone. Suddenly, the large space of the conference room seemed to constrict his breath. He wasn't claustrophobic, not in the slightest, but in the presence of the special agent, even the most open of spaces felt small and restrictive. She was, for lack of a better word, overwhelming. "Here," she said, as she stretched out her hand to take his coffee mug. "Let me get you a refill." She stood and walked to the corner table. As she poured a second serving of the fragrant black liquid into his cup, she looked back at him over her shoulder. "You don't approve of my handling of the situation, Colonel?" It was a statement of fact, not a question. Yet his only instinct was to deny it. Given her age, she would have been manufactured without telepathy, so she wouldn't be able to sense if he lied to her.
"No, ma'am," he replied, "that's not it at all. You have my full support." She returned with his coffee to the conference table and handed him the mug before sitting down in her chair again. When she looked him in the eyes, he felt as transparent as a sheet of glass. She knew. Of course, he thought, you didn't need to be telepathic to spot a lie. People had been able to do that for as long as there had been liars. If you knew the signs, anyone could learn to see when someone wasn't telling the truth. And Special Agent McBrien had half a millennium of experience to lean on in that regard. "I want you to drop this," she told him. "Do not investigate the Etta Botes incident any further." Had he been a civilian, such a request would, of course, have made him even more likely to keep looking into the matter. But he was a Sunguard officer and was expected to follow orders. And the word of a special agent wasn't just an order. She had the authority to create new laws at her discretion, and disobeying her request would literally be a crime. Doing so wouldn't just get him court-martialed. If he wasn't careful, he could end up in a work camp on Mercury for treason against the Terran Federation. "Yes, ma'am," he lied, without so much as a hint of remorse. "This is the last you'll hear of it."
Chapter 3. Discovery.
"Are we really going to drop this, General?" he asked. This time they really were sitting in the bar downtown. General Tellerk was still wearing her uniform, but she had unbuttoned it and was clearly not in the mood to enforce military hierarchies at the moment. The tall glass of dark beer on the table in front of her proved as much. Still, he thought, she was his superior and should be addressed as such, despite being a Jurassian. The woman sighed. "Of course we are." She took a moment to gaze around the busy room before continuing. "I'm not saying I like it, but an order is an order. She's a special agent. Her word is law." "I know, but 100,000 souls and the entire Sunguard is just going to sweep it under the rug like that? People are already asking questions. Ordinary people, I mean. The press. This could turn into a storm." She shrugged. "We'll say it was a natural disaster. A sudden volcanic eruption, perhaps, one that covered the entire place in a lava field. I don't know. Something that'll justify us not going back there again." "But that's not what happened, General." "Who knows? Maybe it was." "She knows." "She's a special agent," General Tellerk repeated. She clearly felt she didn't have to say more on the matter. She probably didn't. "I don't trust her," he said, frustration giving his voice the faintest hint of treason. The general leaned forward, her muscular arms crossed over her chest. "But I do."
Before he could say anything, she volunteered an explanation. "You know my world has seen its share of trouble, right?" she asked. It was a rhetorical question, of course. She was from Jer, after all. "Don't get me wrong," she continued. "I fully support the Solar Council's evacuation policy. It was a democratic decision, and as a Sunguard officer I'm sworn to uphold the law, even if that same law says that as a Jurassian I can't vote until after Nova Solaris. Now, the Liberation Front obviously doesn't agree with that, and having a different opinion is their right, for sure. We're a democracy after all. But using violence against the Federation, that's not acceptable." Colonel Reynolds nodded. He assumed it was a sensitive subject for her and didn't quite know how to respond. Best to say as little as possible, he thought, and let her do the talking. "And so the Sunguard has had to enforce the law there," she continued, seemingly of the same mind. "Of course, you know that. But there have been occasions, I feel, when our police actions have been perhaps a bit too heavy-handed. People have died.
people who were not with the JLF. Obviously, he knew of the Photar-Mer incident. Everyone did. But what to him was a dry story from a history book about something that had happened on an alien world generations ago must, to her, still be an open wound. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said carefully. "Did you lose someone? I mean, did your ancestors?" "No," she replied, nodding. "No, nothing like that."
She laughed a little. It was a nervous chuckle that he didn't quite know how to respond to. "You really don't know how to talk to me about this, do you, Kelile? I'm not made of glass. I'm a Sunguard officer, same as you." "Yes, ma'am." He really couldn't bring himself to call her Ma. "Don't take this as criticism, but historically the Sunguard hasn't always acted as friends to the Jurassian people," she explained. "I see your point," he said, hoping he did. "But the special agents always have. They've always been on our side. Ask any Jurassian who's not with the front. They might spit on the Wolf and the Sun, but they'll never say a bad word about the special agents." "And why is that, ma'am?" She paused, seemingly to let her point sink in. This was important to her. "Because they don't see us as aliens. To them, we're just humans who happen to look a bit different, and who were born under a different sun, and they don't care about those differences. They only see what unites us. When they look at me, they don't see the fur or the paws. They just see a citizen of the Terran Federation." Well, how did you respond to that? Colonel Reynolds certainly didn't consider himself a Terran supremacist. He had no trouble working with a Jurassian superior. He wasn't a racist, right? Then again, if he were perfectly honest with himself, he had to admit he had never seen the Sonmai or the Telemor as equals to the 4 founding races. They were nothing like the Jurassians or the Atarians, just to name a few examples, and they shouldn't be given the same rights. It was simply the natural order of things that Terrans, or Jurassians for that matter, were in charge. Perhaps he thought he wasn't quite as pure of spirit as he liked to believe. Still, those opinions were what made him who he was, and he wasn't going to apologize for them. He certainly wasn't the only one in the Sunguard to feel that way about the aliens.
He bit his lower lip. "If," he said very carefully, "if I were to keep looking into this matter, would you turn me in, General?" Her big brown eyes locked onto his. She snorted, and the sound made her black nose wobble a little. "Exactly how would you be going about doing that, Kelile?" He shrugged. "I'd rather not say. Not until I know where you stand. Unless you order me to, of course, General." She smiled. It was a weak smile, but it was enough. "No, of course not. Just don't get me into trouble. Just don't get yourself into trouble." "I won't, ma'am." Chances were he would.
Trouble came, as trouble usually did, when he wasn't looking for it. It had been 3 weeks since the incident, 3 weeks during which he had spent every waking hour when he wasn't on duty contemplating his treasonous mission. At first, there had been a public uproar, of course. You didn't lose an entire Terran colony without the Terran people noticing. But the public protests and demands for action had been less intense than he had anticipated. There were, of course, a handful of loud voices among those who had lost friends or relatives at Eta Boetes, but he had truly expected the general public to remain interested in the matter far longer than they actually did. In hindsight, he should have known better. This was the last generation that would ever see the sun rise over the snow-covered peak of Olympus Mons. The children of today could swim in the warm swells of Niobe Planitia, but their children would never see Solaris sink below the endless horizon where the sea met the sky. Most of the people around him would still be alive to witness the end of the world. Their last memories of the solar system would be of Luna melting into a formless blob of magma as Nova Solaris, with the finality only physics could guarantee, incinerated the racial home of man.
In the light of the dying sun, the loss of a small colony on a remote world at the far edge of the Terran Federation was quickly forgotten by most, but not by Sunguard Colonel Kelile Reynolds.
Unable to let go, he spent his days absent-mindedly performing his duties as a communications officer at Sunguard headquarters to the best of his abilities, while focusing most of his energy on his secret off-duty investigation. And so, when the crucial piece of evidence he was missing came during active duty hours, in the form of a tedious and highly uninteresting call from the customs officer at the Sunguard Forward Logistics Operations Base at Beta Coma Berenices, rather than during the course of his after-hours investigation, he almost missed it entirely.
September 20th, 1406 UTC. Registration number ABR 47201. Private contractor. Destination, 61 Ursae Majoris. Nothing suspicious. September 20th, 1408 UTC. Registration number CC902. Bergman Lines personnel transport carrying 248 Kotamar refugees evicted from their colony at HR 5553. One suspect on the no-fly list taken into custody. The list and the droning voice of the customs officer went on and on for what seemed like an eternity. September 20th, 1439 UTC. Registration number SG 89034C. Sunguard scout ship coming in from Eta Boötes. September 20th, 1443 UTC. Registration number LAI 33. Private yacht, port of origin 61 Ursae Majoris. Nothing suspicious. Nice ship, though.
Too late, Colonel Reynolds realized he had missed the details of what the man on the other end of space had said. Never mind, he thought. This would all be entered as part of the official Sunguard record. He could always look up the information later. For a moment, he considered setting his official duties aside to study the record as soon as the call from Beta Coma Berenices was over. But he quickly dismissed for thought. Whatever he might feel about the special agent and the cover-up she had instigated, he was still a professional officer. He still had a job to do first. But later that night, when he went off duty, he didn't go home to his small apartment near the end of Christensen Avenue as he usually did. Instead, he stayed behind, careful not to draw too much attention to himself as he retrieved the information he needed from the digital depths of the Sunguard computers. Not that his secrecy really mattered, of course. His very act of reading the records would be logged, and if anyone were to audit the access log, they would see exactly what he had done. He could only hope no one would bother to do so, at least not until he had time to conclude his investigation. In the end, it all turned out to be for nothing. Oh, he did find the relevant customs records, of course. Anything else would have been inconceivable. They were all there, just as the official at the logistics base had said. The private yacht, the evicted refugees, the private contractor, and a host of other ships he cared nothing about. But of the scout ship that had arrived from Eta Boötes 3 weeks after Special Agent Ellie McBrien had declared the system off-limits to the Sunguard, there was no trace to be found. Well, Colonel Reynolds thought, the lack of evidence was, in a sense, evidence itself. Someone had clearly tampered with the customs documentation, and if he could just find out who had done it, he would have a thread to begin pulling on. He smiled to himself. The irony was delicious indeed.
The access log he had initially feared might become his own doom, would in the end turn out to be the very tool he could use to unravel the entire conspiracy. 2 minutes later, his smile had turned into a frown.
No one had changed the documentation. No one had written to it after it was originally created. The digital certificate matched exactly what the customs officer had provided, proving the record Colonel Reynolds had pulled from the memory banks of the Sunguard computers was identical to what had originally been stored there. It had not been altered, not by the customs officer, not by Special Agent McBrien, not by anyone. Except he had been on the original call himself and had heard it with his own ears, and it most definitely didn't match what his eyes were now reading. The black text on his screen seemed to glare at him in defiance of reality. This was simply not possible. Someone out there appeared to have both the will and the technical competence to re-sign official Sunguard documentation, making the tampered version look as if it were original. Doing so wasn't just illegal, it was technically impossible. The certificates were too complex, the encryption too strong for anyone, human or biot, to forge. That was, after all, the whole point of them. The root certificate was securely held by the system itself, by the intelligent computer responsible for the archive, guaranteeing the cryptographic chain of trust was kept entirely within the system and could not be tampered with. And yet, someone had done exactly that. Someone, or something.
Chapter 4. Crisis.
He swore under his breath. Why couldn't he remember the ship's registration number? Why hadn't he paid more attention to the customs officer when he had first heard about it? Now it was gone, and all he could recall was that it had a 9 in it and that it ended with a C. But with 1,000 Sunguard scout ships out there, the search space was simply too large. If he were to stumble upon it, he would probably recognize the number, Colonel Reynolds thought. But the other way around? There was no way he would be able to remember it on his own. Briefly, he considered logging time with a neural writer, hoping the machine would help the memory resurface. The sophisticated circuitry of the writer, carefully controlled by the operating intelligent computer, could induce currents into the nerve cells of his brain and thus affect them with stimuli indistinguishable from those that came from his own senses. It wasn't writing anything per se. Stimuli, yes, perhaps, but certainly not memories. But in order to write, you had to know not just what, but also where and how to combine those new signals with what already existed in his head. You didn't perform brain surgery with your eyes closed, and so the neural writer, while far more famous for its ability to deliver data straight into a human brain, was just as good at reading what was already there. Unfortunately for him, though, its reading limitations were exactly the same as those that regulated its writing. It could interpret the currents in his nerve cells, his thoughts and his emotions, but not his memories, not unless he actively thought about them. If he recalled his own memories, the neural writer could record them from his conscious thoughts, which, of course, made the whole idea unfeasible. The whole problem was that he couldn't remember in the first place. And what's more, logging time with the machine without working on an official active case that required such use would be highly suspicious anyway. No, he would have to find the ship the old-fashioned way. Feeling despair threatening to overwhelm him, he decided to try to look at the problem from a different perspective. Whoever was out there was certainly both very capable and very far-reaching, but she, he, or it wasn't omnipotent. They still lived in the real world. They might be able to erase the travel record of the scout ship, but they wouldn't be able to erase the vessel itself, not unless they decided to blow it up. And this wasn't some civilian craft where the only questions about its disappearance would come from the insurance company. No, this was a military ship, a Sunguard vessel.
If it were to blow up, there would be questions, and in line with Codex Vindicta, those questions would be very severe indeed. So he felt it safe to assume the ship still existed, which meant the records of it would exist as well, or it would be useless within civilized space. Not that that helped him exactly. He still didn't remember its registration number. But he did know it arrived at Beta Comae Baroneses on the 20th. Obviously, it was no longer there, or removing it from the records would have been pointless. If it had gone somewhere else on or after the 20th of September, he should be able to find it at its new destination. There, it'd be just one more ship arriving from Beta Comae Baroneses without any connection to Eta Bootes. That leg of its trip would not be suspicious in the slightest, and Colonel Reynolds felt certain his adversary wasn't foolish enough to draw undue attention to it by erasing a travel log that only contained legitimate routes.
His first search came up empty. Given that Arcturus was the closest major Sunguard base in the area, it seemed likely the scout ship had gone there once it had washed its digital trail of Eta Bootes. Briefly, Colonel Reynolds thought he had found it when the arrival records from Mandela Base showed that a Sunguard ship with registration number SG742905/C had arrived there on the 21st. The number sounded vaguely like what he remembered, but when he dug a little deeper, the vessel turned out to be a troop carrier, not a scout ship. Disappointed, he moved on to the next Sunguard base on his list. Still nothing. 4 hours later, with only Europa and Mars left to check, he was about ready to give up. He had assumed his unknown adversary was hiding out there in the dark void between the stars, not here in the heart of the Solaris system. How wrong he had been. On September 21st, 2803 AD, Sunguard records corroborated by visual recordings from nearby security cameras showed that the small scout ship SG89034/C had touched down on landing pad 14 at Sunguard headquarters on Europa at 1752 Universal Standard Time. The unseen enemy wasn't out there. They were right here, in the heart of the Sunguard's operations. Colonel Reynolds was not surprised in the slightest when his further examination of the records showed that the ship was currently assigned to yet another biotic special agent. At first glance, the evidence seemed damning. His gut told him he was looking at a conspiracy involving the special agents, and yet, when he looked more closely at the data, he couldn't make heads or tails of it. Nothing in the details pointed to any actual wrongdoing. The travel ban on New Caribbean obviously didn't apply to the special agents themselves. It wasn't that they were going to a forbidden system that was suspicious. No, that could just be special agent business. What felt off was that they had been going to the lost colony, despite claiming there was nothing there. What were they really up to? First, Special Agent Ellie McBrien had gone to Eta Bootes, stayed there for a day or two, and then returned. And then, just a couple of weeks later, Special Agent Paul Williams had gone there too, again just for a few hours before returning to Sunguard headquarters. If he didn't know better, he'd think they were just going there for coffee break. He laughed to himself. It was a ridiculous thought. But the laugh turned into a snort when he remembered Special Agent McBrien munching on that cinnamon roll in the conference room where they had met, and how she had taken care to bring him a coffee before dressing him down. What if they really were going to Eta Bootes for coffee?
"We need to escalate this to Solar Command," he said to her, nervously fiddling with the lining of his pocket. General Talark looked up, a frown on her face. He wasn't supposed to talk about this, not here, not in her office. He knew that, but the implications of what he had found were simply too staggering, too important. "You know I can't do that," she replied. He knew she'd say that, of course. She had to. He also knew she would eventually listen to what he had to say. The unknown factor was what she would do about it. Can I at least tell you what I've found?" She sat in silence, the fingers of her hands intertwined as she contemplated his request. "Close the door," she said eventually. In the end, her curiosity had gotten the best of her. When he returned to her desk, he noticed she had closed the blinds of her office windows, too. "What's so important?" "Jan Lamy is alive." There, he could see on her face that he had her attention now. Still, she was careful in her response. "That was one of our original hypotheses," she replied. "We theorized that he had ordered the communications blackout himself and then taken his own hyperspace connection to Europa offline. Remember? That was our best-case scenario. We also shelved that theory because we couldn't prove it," Colonel Reynolds reminded her gently. "And besides, back then the premise of that line of thought was that he had taken it upon himself to initiate the blackout. But now we know at least 2 other special agents are involved. That changes things from a command decision by a special agent to a conspiracy." He was, perhaps, a bit too liberal in how he sprinkled his argument with big words like that. He didn't actually know what was going on. Even his assertion that Lamy was alive was just conjecture. But of all the ideas they had come up with to explain the Eta Boötes incident and the subsequent cover-up by Special Agent McBrien, this was the one version that fit the facts best, he felt. There was one more big word he could use. General Talark would not like this one, not one bit. "I think he has defected from the Sunguard."
That got her attention. The Jurassian woman sat up in her chair, her back straight and her eyes fixed on him. In the military, that was not a word you wielded lightly. In the context of the special agents, you did not use it at all. He could see the gears churning behind her temples. She had warned him not to get them into trouble with his investigation, but back then she had been talking only about his insubordination. This was something else. This was treason on Colonel Reynolds' part, treason of the highest order. You simply did not accuse a Sunguard Special Agent of defection. If you weren't even allowed to question how they took their coffee in the morning, you most certainly were not allowed to have an opinion about why they might have cut off contact with headquarters. "Just look at the evidence, ma'am," he said, before she had a chance to shut him down. Once we had discarded all the unlikely scenarios, like the asteroid impact or the Sunmi uprising, we had 3 plausible theories left. First, a stellar event. Second, deliberate action on Special Agent Lamas's part. And third, an external threat. Now, considering that Special Agent McBrien went there and came back, we can discard the first theory. If it were something that dangerous going on there, even she wouldn't be back to tell the tale. And as for an external threat, well, I have evidence that a second special agent went to Eta Boötes a week ago. If 2 special agents went there and both saw an external threat to the Terran Federation and yet didn't act upon it, and we know they didn't because we're not at war, they're either incompetent or treasonous. We know they're not the former. And while I suppose, in light of my accusation of Lamas going rogue, it wouldn't be unthinkable that others could betray the Federation too, I don't think we need to go quite that far. Not yet. No, I think the far more likely explanation is the one that's left. This was a deliberate act on Special Agent Lamas's part, and the Special Agent Corps is covering it up.
She mulled that over for a moment, before pointing out a flaw in his reasoning. Yet our assumption, when we discussed that option before, was that if the blackout was on purpose, it was a benign event. A special agent always acts in the best interest of the Terran Federation. Whatever reason he might have had for cutting off New Caribbean from the Federation, we assumed it was a good one. Colonel Reynolds sighed. "You're right," he said carefully. "But that was before we knew other special agents were involved. One special agent doing something we don't understand is just a special agent doing special agent things.
Two of them covering up what a third has done. That's not benign. That's a conspiracy. She drummed the fingers of her right hand against her left. There's one other thing, he continued. Remember the other day when we talked about the Photama incident? Ever since you mentioned it, something about it has kept nagging at me. I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was, so I read up on it. Do you remember who the special agent responsible was? General Telek seemed to squirm a little in her chair. Rehema Niasi has been the special agent in charge of Jer for several centuries now. She was responsible for Jer back then too. But she didn't participate in the massacre. She stopped it. I know, Colonel Reynolds admitted. But someone else was there. On October 12, 2718 AD, a special agent killed 23 unarmed civilians in Fotar Mer district. That special agent was NL-27, Mayan Lamy. When the general looked at him, her eyes were filled with sorrow. She knew very well what had happened there that day.
On his first mission, 5 days old, and on direct Sunguard orders, she counted. He can't have known what he was doing, and don't forget he also took down several terrorist cells actively engaged in hostilities against the Terran Federation. He saved the lives of hundreds of soldiers that day too. Perhaps, Colonel Reynolds said, humouring her. Or perhaps not. There's a pattern here. If he was capable of killing 23 civilians back then, it's not inconceivable he could kill 100,000 today. He could see her ambivalence. He could smell her fear in her sweat, sweet and pungent in the small room. "You do know this is career-ending if we're wrong?" she finally asked. It was perhaps an understatement. "I do." "You understand this is career-ending even if we're right, yet go about it the wrong way?" He nodded. "All right," she said, then paused. It was a lot to take in. "All right. So it's a conspiracy. But what is the conspiracy?" He snorted. "Having coffee." The general raised an eyebrow. Despite the tension, she smiled weakly at his joke. "No, I don't think they're literally going to Tabuotis to have coffee with Mian Lamy," he explained. "But they're going there to talk to him, socialize. Then they come back. They're just taking care of their own. He's done something unheard of, and they're trying to understand why. They just want to do it without involving us." General Tallerk seemed to relax a bit. "That I can buy. If that's a conspiracy, it's a benign one."
"I don't agree," Colonel Reynolds replied, shaking his head. "All right, maybe what they're doing is in line with the special agent mandate. They can do whatever they want, of course, but Lamy? Mass murder isn't benign, and defection is treason."
She seemed to consider that. "If that's true, then that's inexcusable, I'll give you that," General Tallerk said after one more long pause. "If he has defected, he has violated his loyalty to the Terran Federation. If. It's still just a theory, right? I haven't seen any concrete proof." "Agreed. But I can't see any fault with the actions of Special Agents McBrien and Williams. They're investigating what has happened. They're under no obligation to involve or inform us, not unless Lamy is a threat to the Federation."
It wasn't exactly a ringing endorsement of his investigation, but at least he had won her over to his side. It would have to do for now.
Chapter 5. Judgment.
He had, in a sense, humoured the general by not pushing the issue. He understood her deep-rooted respect for the special agents and how difficult it would have been for her to see the conspiracy he saw. Truth be told, the defection of one special agent was bad enough. There didn't have to be a conspiracy, too, for them to be a serious threat to the Terran Federation. Yet he firmly believed there was a conspiracy.
because, despite the validity of the arguments he had made to her, he had kept the most damning one close to his chest. It was so easy to get caught up in the defection of Mayan Lame. The very idea that a Sunguard Special Agent could betray their genetic loyalty was simply unfathomable. The notion brought with it such terrors that you could be forgiven for letting your line of thought stop right there. However, this wasn't just a case of the Special Agent Corps protecting one of their own who had defected. Like General Taluk had said, that could be understood, or even excused. No, this was a case of the Special Agents protecting a man who had defected and killed 100,000 people. And that was a conspiracy if he had ever heard of one. But as terrifying as that thought was, it paled in comparison to the other evidence he sat on, the one proof he had that turned the conspiracy from the acts of a small group of special agents into a system-shattering apocalypse. The truth was, he had been wrong when he had initially assessed that forging the digital certificate on Sunguard documents was technically impossible. Oh, the special agents couldn't do it, that much was true. Despite their immense power, they were still essentially human. Even though they were constructed from microscopic self-replicating computer chips rather than from biological cells, their genes, stored as software rather than as DNA, were still, for all practical purposes, human. You didn't just create artificial life out of thin air. That was too complex. 600 years ago, the scientists at the Sunguard's Research and Development Facility on Mars had meticulously, and with the help of their immense intelligent computers, translated Terran DNA into the equivalent biotic computer code. They had modified the code to fit their purposes, of course, adding such things as the math, physics prediction, and communications cortices of the special agents' brains, the radiothermal organs that powered their bodies, and perhaps most important of all, their genetic loyalty to the Terran Federation. But more than 99.9% of their genetic code was still the equivalent of human. They were powerful, yes, but they weren't gods. They still could operate only within the laws of physics and biology, albeit the artificial biotic kind. Thus, even the best, most intelligent biot special agent in existence wouldn't have the mental capacity to go up against the intelligent computers that ran the Sunguard's data banks. Bypassing their all-seeing eyes to replace a digital certificate without them noticing, or at the very least reverting the change, would simply not be possible, even for the best of the biots. And so, Colonel Reynolds had initially dismissed the very idea that someone could do that as impossible. How wrong he had been! Because there was one type of being who not only had the means to do so, but the opportunity as well. An intelligent computer. An intelligent computer like the one responsible for running the Sunguard's digital archive. An intelligent computer that was essentially just one giant biotic brain floating without a body in a tank of non-conductive silicon oil. An intelligent computer that was, in essence, just another form of biot. As conspiracies went, Colonel Reynolds had a hard time seeing how they could be bigger than that.
His musings were disturbed when the door to the conference room opened and General Taluk entered. She sat down next to him without so much as a word. Colonel Reynolds found the silence between them uncomfortable. After less than a minute, he couldn't take it any longer. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said. "I thought I did the right thing. I didn't mean for you to get into trouble like this." That was a euphemism, he thought. Trouble didn't begin to cover the depth of the unpleasantness they were in for. She sighed. "I know you didn't. And I'm the one who brought it up to Admiral Kovalenko. Once I told her I knew she'd informed the rest of Solar Command as well. But it was necessary, and now we're here." Yes, now they were here, indeed.
sitting in a small, windowless conference room 200 meters below the surface of Europa, waiting for whoever the Sunguard would see fit to oversee their judgment. He was glad he hadn't told the general everything. At least now they would only be condemned for the treasonous words he had blurted out, not for the thoughts he had not yet spoken, but which were immensely worse. "I assume they're listening." "Of course," she replied, "but I have nothing to hide." He stayed silent. General Tulurk might be in a confessional mood, but he most certainly wasn't. From outside the wide grey metal doors of the conference room, he heard laughter. 2 female voices were talking over each other. Colonel Reynolds had a hard time making out the words, muffled as they were through the thick doors and obscured by the laughter. But there was a mention of a birthday party, and of someone eating way too many hot chili peppers. With a squeaking sound, the doors were pushed open to reveal Special Agent Ellie McBrien and a second young woman. She, too, was in her early 30s, but unlike Special Agent McBrien, she had long, straight blonde hair and the bluest eyes imaginable. And she, too, wore an unadorned gray jumpsuit with thin red stripes running down its sides.
"Hello," Special Agent McBrien said as she leaned forward across the table, reaching out her hand to shake theirs. "General Tulurk, Colonel Reynolds, it's good to meet you again." She smiled. The smile of the wolf before turning on its prey, Colonel Reynolds thought darkly. He shuddered, but still shook her hand. She had no formal rank and existed entirely outside the traditional military hierarchy, and so he was under no obligation to salute her. Most soldiers of the Sunguard tended to treat the special agents the way they would behave toward an admiral of Solar Command, though. Still, the Solar Wolves themselves rarely insisted on anything more than a simple handshake. The blonde woman next to her did the same as she introduced herself. "Hello, I'm Special Agent on the Kinnunen. At the request of Solar Command, I'll sit in on this briefing too." Colonel Reynolds nodded. There wasn't much he could do about it now. He did notice her use of the word briefing, though. That was, he assumed, yet another euphemism. The 2 special agents sat down on the opposing side of the table. Silence entered the room once more, like a soft blanket of despair. Clearly, they were waiting for more participants before the executions could begin. The doors opened once more. General Tulurk shot up from her chair, snapping to attention. When Colonel Reynolds looked up at the newest participant in their meeting, he did the same. High Admiral Okamoto returned their salutes without so much as a glance at the Jurassian general. "At ease," he said. "Sit down, please." When they had resumed their places, he turned to the special agent seated to his right and continued, "Before we begin, let me make it clear that I'm here representing Solar Command." That had the expected effect on the 2 biotes. "Yes, sir," they responded, almost in unison. While they could command the individual admirals of Solar Command, they could not give orders to the Sunguard leadership as a whole.
"Well, let's get started then," High Admiral Okamoto declared. "Let me just summarize where we stand. We've all read Colonel Reynolds's brief. General Tulurk is here in her capacity as his superior officer and the one who brought this matter to our attention. Special Agent McBrien is present because she's the focus of the accusations leveled by Colonel Reynolds against the Special Agents Corps. And finally, I've requested the presence of Special Agent Kinnunen as a counterbalance. Special Agent McBrien is an early model. Let's say she's from the 23rd century. The red-haired special agent seemed about to voice a protest, but caught herself at the last moment and stayed quiet. Special Agent Kinnunen, on the other hand, was taken online only a few decades ago, the High Admiral continued. I wanted to have the viewpoint of a recent model present as well.
Something in what the Supreme Commander of the Sunguard had said bothered Colonel Reynolds. At first, he couldn't put his finger on it, but then he remembered the third person he had identified as part of the conspiracy and realized what was missing from the room. There was no telepathic special agent here. Ellie McBrien was old enough that the telepathic cortex hadn't been invented yet when she was taken online, and Anna Kinnunen was new enough that Sunguard R&D had engineered it away again. Only the mid-range special agents, like Paul Williams, were able to read and influence minds by interpreting the electromagnetic fields of biological brains and inducing currents into them in response, like neural writers on legs. And none of them were present here. It was curious, but he didn't know what it implied. Perhaps there was no reason behind it, or perhaps it was intentional.
High Admiral Okamoto leaned forward from his position at the end of the table. Let me begin with the point of contention brought forth by Colonel Reynolds. Mayan Lamy. We have the testimony of Special Agent McBrien that he has been lost to the Sundard. I believe those were your words, yes? He turned toward Special Agent McBrien. Is he, or is he not, alive? She hesitated. Sir, she said carefully, my testimony stands. He is no longer available to the Sunguard. I do not consider his status beyond that to be relevant. Let Solar Command be the judge of that, High Admiral Okamoto countered. Again, is he dead?
He is not, Special Agent McBrien admitted. Colonel Reynolds is correct in that regard. Former Special Agent Mayan Lamy no longer considers himself a member of the Sunguard. So he has effectively defected. That's an accurate description, yes, sir. Should he then be considered an enemy of the Terran Federation? Special Agent McBrien paused for a moment before replying, It is my personal conviction that Mayan Lamy is not, and will never be, an enemy of the people of the Terran Federation, no. And you base that assessment on what, Special Agent McBrien? He cannot break his loyalty, sir. And yet he defected? I find that statement baffling. Defecting doesn't automatically make him an enemy, sir, she explained, or at least tried to. He doesn't want to be a weapon. He doesn't want. It was as if the Supreme Commander of the Sunguard couldn't process the notion. As a special agent, Lamy's very purpose of existence was to serve, to uphold the law, and to enforce the peace. His need to do so was part of his genetic loyalty. He shouldn't be able to not want that.
Sir, Federation law is clear on the definition of the term human, Special Agent Kinnunen chimed in. Any being belonging to a species possessing the mental capacity to develop and use technology is, by definition, human. That includes the Terrans, the alien civilizations we've encountered, the biots, and the intelligent computers. She turned toward General Tilak. Would you agree that is an accurate summary, General? The Jurassian nodded. Yes, ma'am. That's how we've always defined humanity. The blonde special agent turned her attention back toward the Supreme Commander. And before we forget, there's another word we need to define. Slavery, meaning to own another human being. It's something that's been outlawed since long before the formation of the Terran Federation. If Lamy doesn't want to work for the Sunguard anymore, he cannot legally be forced to. High Admiral Okamoto seemed to mull that over. That may be so, he said eventually. If it's truly what he wants, then I can't object. I grant you that. But my objection isn't based on his legal status as a human. I don't dispute that. What I do dispute is that he should be physically able to want something other than serving the Sunguard in the first place. I'm questioning the technical reasons behind his defection, not the moral ones.
The technical reasons can be handled, Special Agent McBrien said, brushing the issue aside. I think we should focus on the fallout instead. Meaning? Meaning we don't want anyone to look too closely at Mayan Lami's defection, not the public, not the press, and not the rest of the Sunguard. And how do you suggest we go about doing that? For the briefest of moments, Special Agent McBrien glanced in Colonel Reynolds' direction before she continued. By enforcing the quarantine of Eta Bootes, let him stay there, cut off from the Terran Federation for the rest of time, or until he changes his mind and decides to come back. General Talark had some ideas for handling the public perception of the issue.
She turned toward the Jurassian. Would you kindly tell us your thoughts, General? Yes, ma'am, the woman replied, her black fur bristling nervously. Eta Bootes is expanding, and has done so for several 100 million years now. The Fourth World, which used to be covered in ice and home only to primitive life, is now a planet with a tropical climate. But with its star's expansion also comes increased tidal forces. The core of New Caribbean is slowly heating up. While this is a process that takes millions of years, it does mean tectonic activity is dangerously high there. Claiming the colony was lost due to a supervolcanic eruption would be entirely reasonable. Special Agent McBrien nodded. While I don't exactly approve of that lie, there are situations where deceptions are necessary. I believe this is a viable way forward. The Supreme Commander stayed silent for a moment, thinking about what the two special agents had said. All right, he concluded. I'll defer to your judgment there. I will propose to the Solar Council that Eta Bootes be excluded from the Terran Federation and designated a no-fly zone. We can't have people starting to believe our biots can't be trusted. Information about Lami's defection will be compartmentalized and contained within the Sunguard on a need-to-know basis. The two special agents nodded. And speaking of judgment, High Admiral Okamoto continued, even though this issue has been resolved amicably, Colonel Reynolds here did, with the approval of his commanding officer, I should add, disobey a direct order. While I'm grateful this was brought to our attention, obeying a lawful order is still not optional. There will have to be consequences. The lump in his throat felt very real, Colonel Reynolds thought. For a moment he had managed to forget his own situation, focused as he had been on the continuous stream of revelations coming from Special Agent McBrien. This had been the culmination of the validation of his investigation, and he hadn't wanted to miss one bit of it. But now, with all her cards on the table, it was his turn to face judgment. I see no reason for that, sir, Special Agent McBrien said, to his surprise, contradicting the High Admiral. There was no malice involved in Colonel Reynolds' investigation. I do not want to give the impression that he's being reprimanded simply out of spite. High Admiral Okamoto turned to him. I'm not quite prepared to go that far, but I respect the special agent's opinion. Your record will carry an official warning of insubordination, but there will be no punishment beyond that. What do you say, Colonel Reynolds? You have your answers now. Can you drop this line of inquiry so we can put all this behind us? Yes, Colonel Reynolds lied with confidence. Of course, sir. Special Agent McBrien looked at him again, her green eyes as deep and unfathomable as time itself.
Chapter 6. Nightmare.
Colonel Reynolds wasn't sure how to feel about the outcome of the meeting. On the surface, the decisions made there were clearly ridiculous. Abandoning an entire star system and forgetting the deaths of 100,000 colonists just to exile a mass murderer? It was utterly ludicrous. But if you looked deeper at the larger issue, he had to admit the decision made a whole lot of sense. For a moment he allowed the what-ifs to play out in his head. What if the knowledge of Mian Lammas's defection, one way or another, became public?
What if people learned that a special agent could betray the trust they had placed in him? If they could no longer depend on the special agents, their faith in the Sunguard would quickly erode as well. The special agents were the vanguard, the tip of the spear, the harbingers of justice. Without them as impartial guardians, there would be no one left to mediate the tensions inherent in the Terran Federation. In the long run, the Sunguard alone would not be sufficient. For more than one of the races of the Federation, the military was seen as part of the problem, not the solution. Without the special agents to calm things down, some of those races were sure to rebel, and then the uprisings would no longer be contained to just Jer. Chances were that without their biotic enforcers, the Terran Federation would eventually collapse into civil war, resulting in deaths in the millions and the loss of not just one star system, but several. Writing off Eta Bortis now was costly, to be sure, but compared to the alternative, it was a low price to pay. Had he been in High Admiral Okamoto's shoes, he would probably have made the same choice. And yet Colonel Reynolds couldn't stop there. When he looked even deeper at what had transpired in that room, he couldn't help but notice that the meeting had done nothing more than preserve the status quo.
When they had walked into the meeting, Eta Bortis had already been a forbidden system because of an order issued by a special agent. When they left, it was forbidden because of official Sunguard policy, soon to be enacted into law by the Solar Council. The reason was different, but it was still forbidden, just the same. Furthermore, no questions about the technical reasons behind Lami's defection had really been answered. Special Agent McBrien had conveniently brushed those concerns aside when they were raised by the High Admiral. The answer to the question of how a genetically loyal being like Lami could betray the Terran Federation was still just as unknown after the meeting as it had been before it. And crucially, no one had addressed the loss of the colonists. The meeting had been all about the biots. It was one thing to write off the regular people of Eta Bortis after the fact. As horrible as that calculus seemed at first glance, he understood it. But even if they couldn't bring Lami to justice for what he had done, they could at least have found out what had transpired there. Yet on that subject, they were still just as much in the dark after the meeting as they had been before it started. Even his own status hadn't really changed. The warning on his record was an inconvenience, not a punishment. As long as he didn't get into trouble again, it would have no practical effect on him.
All in all, the meeting had been nothing more than a long sequence of hand-waving, a smokescreen expertly coordinated by the special agents to bury any questions Solar Command might have about their conduct. And High Admiral Okamoto had fallen for it, hook, line, and sinker. But beyond the questions of what had befallen the colony and how it was possible for a genetically loyal biot to defect, the third question that remained for him was probably the most important of them all. Who, or what, was tampering with Sunguard records? In fact, the question was so important that he hadn't even attempted to bring it up at the meeting. He hadn't mentioned it in his briefing to General Tellerk, and there hadn't really been an opportunity for him to raise it during the meeting anyway. It wasn't just a matter of his lack of evidence. While he knew the records had been expertly modified, his assertion that it had been done by the very same intelligent computer responsible for preserving their integrity was still just conjecture, but also a matter of not tipping his hand. General Tellerk had never really seen the conspiracy. The special agents had pulled the wool over the eyes of the High Admiral, and now Solar Command didn't see it either. But Colonel Reynolds still did, and he would not let them get away with it.
The deeper he looked, the more nightmarish the situation seemed to become. Where did you even begin your investigation when you were questioning the system itself? An intelligent computer was nothing like its dumb counterparts.
These weren't machines in the traditional sense. They were persons with consciousness and feelings, no different from a biological human, except in the speed and accuracy of their thoughts. They didn't run on software the way a dumb computer did. You couldn't just download and run a new diagnostics program on them to find out what had gone wrong. Well, that wasn't entirely true, of course. Their biotic cells did run on software, but that software only guided the growth and specialization of the microscopic chips that took the place of neurons in a human brain. Once an intelligent computer had grown to adulthood, it was the structure it had grown into that formed the basis of its function, not the software that had guided that growth. They were the way they were, and behaved the way they did because of the way their artificial neurons were physically connected to one another. It was no different from how a human brain worked. Just as you couldn't simply download a new program into the mind of a man, you could not do it into that of an intelligent computer. The best you could do was ask questions and interpret the answers the way a human therapist or interrogator would do. But a human interrogator normally worked with clients whose mental capacity was roughly on par with their own. The intelligent computers, on the other hand, operating with neural connections, had transmitted electrical signals at close to the speed of light, processed thoughts at velocities that made the slow electrochemical signals of his own nervous system seem to crawl in comparison. The computer would outsmart him at every turn. It would be like an interrogator trying to solve a crime where the only witness was also secretly the perpetrator, and the interrogator was merely a small child. Where would he even begin when he couldn't trust that the information presented on the computer screens before him accurately represented what was actually stored inside that same computer? And how could he trust that what was stored inside that computer accurately represented the real world? His whole investigation felt Kafkaesque, as if reality itself were malleable and the truth behind it continuously drifted away whenever he tried to grasp it. In the end, he had to admit defeat. He was up against an adversary he could not even begin to compete with, and for the moment this particular line of inquiry would have to wait. There were other avenues for him to take. He'd have to go to the source.
Chapter 7. Loyalty.
The details are, of course, classified, Dr. Totnametul explained patiently from the other side of the comm screen. I can only give you a general overview of the process we use when we design a new line of special agents. I'm sure that will be enough, Colonel Reynolds replied, trying to sound as pleasant and friendly as possible. I'm not a computer scientist. I probably wouldn't be able to make heads or tails of the details anyway. Well, in that case, let me explain what I can, said the technician at the Sunguard Research and Development Division on Mars. First of all, I need to dispel you of the notion that we program the biotic cells of the special agents. We don't. The genetic code is much too complicated for a human to write. If we were to try to modify it by hand, we'd make too many mistakes, and the result would be catastrophic mutations. No, we only give general, high-level instructions to our intelligent computers, and they translate our designs into actual biotic genetic code. Machines making machines, Colonel Reynolds muttered. I don't mean to criticize your work, Doctor, but that sounds almost ominous. The Atarian chuckled softly.
You have no idea how many times I've heard that, he said. But there's really nothing nefarious going on here. Computer-aided design has always been part of the development process. I don't just mean for biots. We've used computers to design computers all the way back to the early integrated circuits. There's really no other way to do it. These kinds of systems are simply too large and too complex for a human mind to grasp on its own. I'll trust you on that then, Doctor. What more can you tell me? The technician continued his explanation.
Second, genetic code isn't really like computer programs. It doesn't just run from start to finish with well-defined branches and loops and variables.
It's not an algorithm per se. Genetic code is all executed at once, in a sense, depending on inhibiting and activating genes rather than on branches. Now, the software inside the biotic cells is still classic Turing-complete code, of course, but in order to facilitate the translation process from Terran DNA to biotic code, the software we run in the biotic chips emulates the inhibition and activation behavior of biological genetic code. Effectively, the biotic cells do much the same job the biological cells in your own body do, even though the mechanism behind them is very different.
Colonel Reynolds didn't understand everything in Dr. Totnamatul's explanation, but that wasn't the point. He hadn't called the technician to learn about biot architecture. This was just the friendly preamble meant to make him open up and allow Colonel Reynolds to ask his real question. "No, I get that," he lied. "I'm quite familiar with the system. What I'm interested in is the actual modifications you make, the differences from the original donor DNA that you introduce in the translation process. Specifically, I'm curious about the loyalty genes." "Of course, sir," the Atarian technician replied, the wrinkles on his triangular head stretching and contracting as he smiled. "Again, the details are secret. If you want, I could ask the special agent in charge for permission to give you access to the classified portions." He felt his throat constrict. "Oh, no, that won't be necessary," he replied, trying to sound as nonchalant as possible. "I'm sure your general overview will be quite satisfactory."
"I take pride in being thorough, sir," the doctor said. "I'm glad Sunguard headquarters is taking an active interest in my work. I'd be more than happy to tell you everything I can, sir. What specifically is it that you want to know?" "How strong is the genetic loyalty, and exactly what are the instructions encoded within it? What would it take for someone to break that loyalty?" "Ah," Dr. Totnamatul said smugly, realization dawning on his pink face. "The NL-27 case. I should have known." The man was already aware of Lami's defection. So much for compartmentalization, Colonel Reynolds thought. "You're familiar with the case, Doctor?" "Yes, of course. It's my job." Of course it was. He should have realized that. Still, this provided him with an opportunity. If the R&D technician thought his call was part of the official Sunguard debriefing, he would probably be more inclined to provide Colonel Reynolds with what he needed. Perhaps even to the extent of skirting the classification line if he could smooth-talk the man enough.
And how does it work?
Yes, the technician replied somewhat absent-mindedly. "The strength, it's both absolute and it isn't. The genetic loyalty is encoded as an instinct. Our special agents aren't aware of it in terms of words. It's more of a feeling that permeates them deeply and affects everything they do. Imagine your own instinct to eat when you're hungry or to back away from the edge of a high cliff. You don't have to follow that instinct. You still have free will. But even though you can go against it, you won't. People jump, Dr. Totnamatul. Tragically, it happens." "Indeed, which is why I said the loyalty both is and isn't absolute. Healthy, stable, and mentally well people don't jump off cliffs just because they want to. Those cases are aberrations, and our special agents are not. Their genes have been screened for centuries for any code that could trigger such episodes. Every biot we've made since NA01 has been completely stable. For 6 centuries, there has not been a single aberration." "I'm aware of that, Doctor. Everyone is, I think. I'm not questioning your work." "Thank you.
What I'm trying to say is that while a special agent could, in theory, go against their loyalty instinct, in practice, those we create have been made from templates we've selected that are stable enough that we know they will not do so. They can, but they won't? Exactly. That was interesting. He might have to inquire more about that later.
So, in your professional opinion, did NL-27 violate his genetic loyalty? Dr. Totnamatul paused for a few seconds before replying. No, I can't see that happening. Very interesting indeed, Colonel Reynolds thought. That was consistent with what the special agents themselves had told him previously. Myan Lamy could not have violated his loyalty.
Reynolds didn't trust the special agents anymore, but he had no reason to believe the Sunguard technician would lie about the matter. That didn't necessarily mean he was right, but the man was a professional. He knew what he was talking about, and he believed Lamy had somehow managed to defect without violating his loyalty genes. And yet the former special agent had condemned an entire Terran colony to oblivion. How was that not a betrayal of the trust the Terran Federation had placed in him? My second question was about the actual instructions encoded in the loyalty genes. What are the specifications?
That's a bit complicated, Dr. Totnamatul explained. The instructions have changed over time. The Terran Federation of today isn't the same as it was when it was first founded. The loyalty genes are continuously updated to reflect those changes. The first biot we made was based on the genetic template of a biological special agent, one Elizabeth Mbenge. The loyalty genes for NA01 were mostly based on Special Agent Mbenge's own sense of duty and loyalty, with some corrections. They were quite broad, not very detailed, just a very strong drive to enforce the major policies championed by the Terran Federation at the time: adherence to the law, respect for human rights and everyone's equality, and to democratic principles. She was the most advanced weapon ever created in the history of the four races, and we needed that kind of genetic oversight to rein her in. In fact, you could talk to NA01 herself about the details if you want. I think I heard she's stationed on Aphrodite at the moment. That's Special Agent Amir, to be clear. She never changed her given name like most special agents do. Funny thing, Special Agent Lamy never did either. That's a strange coincidence. I guess those two have more in common than you'd think, despite being separated by 13 generations. Although the idea of talking to a 6 centuries-old biot held immense appeal for him, he felt it would only get him sidetracked. Maybe later, when this was all over, he'd look her up. Instead, he continued to press Dr. Totnamatul on the details.
How have they been changed, Doctor? Well, for example, when the decision was made to limit voting rights for non-Terrans, we couldn't have the special agents go round championing universal suffrage anymore. That would have torn the Terran Federation apart. The exact wording of the design documents are classified, though. So their loyalty genes were updated to reflect current policies. I assume we're only talking about the new models. How did you handle the old ones? Yes and no. The new models, like NL-27, were manufactured with the latest version of the loyalty genes wired directly into them, of course. But the older models were updated too, to make sure they all run on current code. How did you do that? They periodically come in for maintenance. Their genes are updated wirelessly. It's just software. It can be changed. So you're saying that when there's a disagreement about policy between what is encoded within the special agents and what is put in place by the Solar Council, the Sunguard just forces the new opinions into their genes? That seems almost like a violation. He couldn't believe he was defending those monstrous machines.
Then again, he was just playing devil's advocate here.
The technician laughed a little. It would be if it worked like that, but their genes are protected by a digital certificate. Half of the encryption key for that certificate is memorized by the special agent in question. They need to provide it voluntarily, or the update process will fail. The Sunguard provides the other half, of course. The R&D division's intelligent computers keep our segment in their secure memories. Together, the two parts form a key that unlock the special agent's genes and allow them to be updated.
Again, a digital certificate held in a biotic mind. There seemed to be a pattern there, but he couldn't quite see what it was. All right. I assume that means the old special agents have refused the updates then. I can't imagine they'd consent to have their most deep-seated opinions forcefully overwritten every other year. Not quite that often, Dr. Totnamatul replied. But no, they never refuse. Never. It's never happened. Never. Remember, they're genetically loyal to the Terran Federation. Why would they refuse an update that would align them better with the current policies? To Colonel Reynolds, that seemed to be something of a circular argument, but he didn't press the issue.
But speaking of updates, there was one thing that had bothered him for the past few days. He didn't know if it was relevant to his current investigation. If it was, he didn't quite see how. But since he already had the doctor on the line, he thought he'd ask, just to be safe. The loyalty genes are not the only thing that's different between today's models and the early ones, correct? Take, telepathy, for example. Something about the topic seemed to make Dr. Totnamatul uncomfortable, though Colonel Reynolds couldn't understand why.
Yes, between 2298 and 2694 AD, we manufactured special agents with telepathy cortices. The practice was abandoned, eventually. Why? Sunguard policy. It's not exactly my field of expertise, but the Solar Command eventually decided special agents shouldn't have that power. I assume it was for privacy reasons. You're certain it was removed from the specification on a directive from the Sunguard, not from the Solar Council? The technician squirmed a bit. So this was the source of his discomfort with the topic, Colonel Reynolds thought. It was indeed a bit odd. Privacy policies affected civilians, and thus they were regulated by the civilian government. It shouldn't be up to the military to decide on policies that were under the purview of the Solar Council. Quite certain, yes. It seems strange that the Sunguard had chosen to remove telepathic abilities from their guardians on their own initiative, almost as if they didn't want their own best operatives to know what they were thinking. He couldn't help but remember the absence of a telepathic special agent in that meeting with High Admiral Okamoto. Was there a second conspiracy going on here, independent of what the special agents were doing? Not just the biots against the biologicals, but also the Solar Command against whom? That was one more data point to file under the label of things Colonel Reynolds found interesting, but didn't fully understand the significance of.
Chapter 8. Wolf.
In a sense, his clandestine investigation had come to an end. Finding out who had been tampering with the records in the Sunguard archive had turned out to be impossible, simply because his unseen adversary was too powerful for him to even begin to compete with. His efforts to reveal why Myan Lami had defected had become a dead end, because everyone involved was, quite sincerely, certain the former special agent had in fact not violated his genetic loyalty. From what he had learned, Colonel Reynolds was inclined to believe them. And the lost colonists? The answer to that conundrum was forever buried on Eta Bootes 4. The answer was on Eta Bootes 4.
With a jerk, Colonel Reynolds sat up. His whole investigation had been conducted on the premise that it had to be clandestine, that he'd somehow, in the end, get away with his secret insubordination. And so he had approached the conspiracy from the shadows, hiding his trail to the best of his abilities as he diligently worked away from his workstation at Sunguard headquarters to try to resolve the discrepancies he had found. But he hadn't been able to keep his investigation secret. The Sunguard already knew about his insubordination. If it hadn't been for Special Agent McBrien's intervention, he'd already be sitting in a cell on Mercury rather than at his own desk. Then he had lied to the face of the Supreme Commander of the Sunguard and still continued his investigation. As acts of insubordination went, you couldn't really be more overt than that. The truth was, it was only a matter of time before he got caught again. All he had to do was ensure he unraveled the root of the conspiracy before that happened, which meant time, not secrecy, was paramount.
The answer was out there, waiting for him on New Caribbean. He could just take a Sunguard shuttle there and see for himself. Well, perhaps it wasn't quite that simple, Colonel Reynolds thought. As a Sunguard officer, he could certainly requisition a ship. That wasn't the problem. But the hyperspace jump would be plotted by the onboard computer, and that computer would obviously refuse to send him to a system in a no-fly zone. But he didn't actually have to go to Eta Boetes. Beta Comae Berenices, for example, wasn't in the no-fly zone. He could easily jump there and then find a private contractor willing to bend the rules a bit to take him the last step of the way. The repeated visits there by the special agents had more or less proved there was no inherent danger in the system, and with the right kind of pressure applied, it shouldn't be too difficult to find someone willing to take him to New Caribbean. The flight restrictions were quite recent after all. If he was lucky, he'd run into a pilot who hadn't even heard of them yet. And if not, well, the wolf in the sun could be quite intimidating indeed if applied the right way. It wasn't like he had to tell the pilot his investigation was unsanctioned. And going to Beta Comae Berenices shouldn't in itself raise any suspicions. He was a communications officer assigned to the Arcturus region after all. No one would bat an eye if he had to go out in the field there now and then. It wouldn't be the first time he had had to do so anyway. Now all he had to do was sneak away without raising Special Agent McBrien's suspicion.
He had boarded the small ship from the freight terminal at the edge of landing field 27. After removing his helmet, he continued taking off his thick grey gloves. He was just in the process of unlocking the air seal around his wrist when a bright voice from the small cockpit made it clear to him that he was not alone on board the vessel. "Good morning, Colonel Reynolds. Please join me up here when you're ready." As the woman looked back at him over the seat of the pilot's chair, her long red hair, which she had draped over the headrest, rustled as she moved. Ellie McBrien. Special Agent Ellie McBrien. Biotic Special Agent Ellie McBrien. It was all over. He had been so close. What was left for him to say? There was nothing he could do to rescue the situation now. She knew. Everything. Of course she did. She had only waited for him to tie the noose around his own neck a bit tighter before she struck.
"Hello," he said, feeling dizzy. "Hello," she giggled in response. "I understand you're going on a little trip," she continued, her face serious once more. "I'd like to accompany you, but we're not going to Eta Boetes." Obviously not, he thought, more like to Mercury. He said nothing. "I've already taken the liberty of laying in the new course sunward," she told him as he sank down into the co-pilot's chair and fastened his seatbelt. "It should be about 20 minutes before we're high enough in your roper's gravity well to jump."
Special Agent McBrien continued to busy herself with the instrumentation on board the craft, checking and rechecking the readouts as she adjusted the parameters of their trajectory. Minutes passed in silence as the red and white ice of the moon receded behind them. Suddenly, she chuckled and turned toward him. "Oh, don't be so skittish, Colonel Reynolds. From the way you look at me, you'd think I'm some kind of vampire here to drink your blood. No one's out to get you. I just want to show you something." He finally worked up the courage to trust his voice again. "Well, where are we going, then?" "Mars."
Just one word. That was all she said as she winked at him. "Look, Colonel Reynolds," she continued after a while. "You don't like me. I get that. People see what they want to see, and you biologicals are so easily clouded by your past experiences, so quick to place people in buckets, one for us and another for them. I don't blame you for disliking me, but you might be surprised to hear that I actually like you." First, silence. Then, carefully. "Why is that?" He deliberately withheld the honorific. She turned to him. "Had you been born 700 years ago, before we switched to using biots, you would have been selected for special agent training. You're inquisitive, intelligent, and resourceful. You dare ask questions that you honestly believe need to be raised, no matter the circumstances. And you don't fall for peer pressure. You follow the evidence wherever it leads you, with little regard for your own safety or convenience. Had it not been for your propensity for racism, you would have been perfect for the role during those early days when special agents were still biological. Your derogatory views of the other races would eventually have disqualified you, of course. Back then, such opinions were not tolerated the way they are today." Colonel Reynolds felt his cheeks burn with humiliation from the scolding the half-millennial old woman next to him had given him. Whatever happened, he would have to seriously think through his own convictions when this was all over. Then again, if the biots had a problem with him being racist, he certainly had a problem with them committing mass murder. "You're right, ma'am." He could afford to offer her the honorific now. In his mouth, it became a curse. "I don't like you. You're so far above us that you don't even see us. We're ants beneath your feet, to be ignored or stamped on at your own discretion." His outburst wasn't exactly professional, and he felt a tinge of embarrassment at his behavior. But all his cards were already on the table, and he had lost the game. Whatever he said or did now didn't matter anymore. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Colonel," the special agent replied. "Most people don't, I'm happy to say. You're quite unique in that regard." "It's your duty to protect the Terran Federation," he exclaimed, exasperated. "And yet you do nothing when one of your own kills 100,000 Federation citizens." She looked at him in silence. Her deep green eyes still did not show any sorrow for the lives lost at Eta Boetes. Finally, she spoke. "Like I said before, you see what you want to see." "What do you mean?" "What did I tell you happened on New Caribbean?" "Nothing. You told me nothing." "You said the colony had been destroyed and that there was nothing left of it." "Almost right, but not quite," she smiled at him. "You don't have perfect recall, but I do. I said the colony was destroyed, yes. I also said there was nothing left there for you. I never said anything about the people living there, just the place. My Unlami sabotaged everything there that made it a colony. The communications equipment, the hyperspace-capable ships they had, and the technology needed to repair them. He cut them off from the rest of the galaxy. New Caribbean is no longer a colony of the Terran Federation. They're on their own now. There's nothing for you there." He felt as if the rug had been pulled out from under his feet. Everything he had assumed, well,
At least he now knew why she had shown no sympathy for the dead when she first presented her findings after returning from her initial fact-finding mission to Eta Buotes. There had been no casualties and no one to mourn. "I'm not saying I agree with him doing so," she continued. "In fact, I don't. He's always been prone to rash decisions, but I can understand why he did it. And now that it's done, we need to handle it."
Why are you telling me all this? Because you were getting close to revealing a much bigger truth, one that we could never allow the Sunguard or the leadership of the Terran Federation to learn. The real secret that your questions about Mihon's genetic loyalties threaten to expose. If you had been allowed to keep digging, sooner or later someone with the necessary expertise would have taken notice of your investigation, and then they would have taken a closer look at his genes. We couldn't allow that to happen. He raised his eyebrow. "So you're admitting there's a conspiracy?" "Of course I'm admitting it," she chuckled. "Why shouldn't I? You already know there is one. I would just sound silly if I were to deny it now, wouldn't I? Now that I know, what will you do to me when we reach our destination? This is one of those, I can tell you, but then I'll have to kill you types of situations, right?" She laughed, a clear, carefree laugh, the kind a good friend might give when you've said something truly funny to her. "You are kidding, right?" He hadn't been, but he decided not to admit that to her.
"If I didn't even want to have you court-martialed, I most certainly wouldn't want you dead," she explained. "Besides, you know very well capital punishment is without exception prohibited by the Constitution of the Terran Federation. We usually treat the Constitution as more of a recommendation than a rule," he countered darkly. The special agent just glared at him. "I assumed what you said to High Admiral Okamoto was a euphemism," he continued. "You didn't want to invoke scrutiny by turning me into a martyr." She looked at him as if he were a small child. He felt like one. Once again, people hear what they want to hear. In this case, the Supreme Commander heard exactly what I wanted him to, but that wasn't what I said. The truth is far simpler. I meant every word. You committed treason because you genuinely care about justice and accountability and the fate of 100,000 people. I didn't want you to get hurt because of a decision I was responsible for making." She was a very strange woman indeed.
Chapter 9. Guardian.
They had landed at the Sunguard Research and Development Division facilities on Mars a little less than an hour ago. Special Agent McBrien still hadn't told him what they were there to see or do. Instead, she had taken him to the lunchroom, of all places. There, she had heaped 2 plates full to the brim with the strangest mix of Terran and alien dishes he could ever have imagined, and now she sat across from him at the small green table in the cafeteria, eating and, despite not needing food at all because of her biotic nature, clearly enjoying it very much. It was just before noon local time, and the room was filled with a myriad of technicians, research scientists, and Sunguard officers, all taking a well-deserved break from their respective projects. But glancing around, Colonel Reynolds concluded from their uniforms that the only special agent present was McBrien. He caught some of the personnel looking in her direction. They were mostly stares of pride and comfortable familiarity, not of curiosity, as if she were a tool that had returned home after many years away, and now they were quietly assessing the success of their creation. They admired how sharp and shiny it was. But now he saw through it all. He was convinced this was all a deception, carefully orchestrated by the special agents themselves to hide their true strength, to make their creators underestimate them. After all, you wouldn't expect your hammer to rise up against you, would you?
Looking at his plate, he decided he wasn't really hungry, but he had brought with him a small pile of spring rolls from the buffet table and was slowly snacking on them while he waited for the special agent to finish eating. They weren't alien, of course. He was biological and could only eat Terran food. They were just regular Vietnamese spring rolls, not too different from those his mother and grandmother used to make for him when he was a kid back on Gloria. "You like them?" Special Agent McBrien asked, pointing to his plate, her face plastered with a big, happy smile. "They're usually pretty good. Can I have one?" Colonel Reynolds nodded, not sure what to say. The whole situation was too bizarre.
While he waited for her to finish her much too large meal, he looked around. The walls of the room were lined with portraits of the special agents manufactured here, almost 200 of them. All the famous ones were there. Emea Nyasi, of course, Morelli, McBrien herself, they were all there. 6 centuries of history, 600 years of Pax Lupi. "They're all alive, you know," she said, following his gaze. "Every one of them is still out there, doing their jobs, protecting the people of the Terran Federation. They stand in the darkness. They hold the line." "It's impressive, I'll give you that," he admitted. "It is, but you don't know half of it. Yet. You'll see. Soon." She pointed to her lunch. "I'll just have to finish this first." Eventually, both her plates were empty and they proceeded to their true destination. He followed her into a small white elevator, hidden in a side wing of the building and guarded by multiple Sunguard soldiers, their guns trailing them as they approached the door. The elevator itself had several elaborate security measures built into it, from multispectral cameras to chemical fingerprinting. None of them reacted to her presence nor to his. The ride itself seemed to go on forever as the metal coffin descended into the depths of the planet. The faint whine of the electric motors hummed in the air. 2 kilometers, she explained, deep down into the Martian bedrock, completely cut off from the rest of the world.
When they finally stopped, the door opened to let them out into a sterile, brightly lit room, covered in ceramic plates from floor to ceiling, except for the lumen panels interspersed between them. There was a faint metallic smell in the air, but there was no dust. To their right, an open doorway led to a wider complex of corridors, all equally white and well lit.
You have just entered the most secure facility in the entirety of the Terran Federation, Colonel Reynolds. This is the heart of Project 18, the Sunguard Research and Development Division's biotic program. This is the foundation upon which the state is built.
Despite his apprehension, he could not avoid being struck by awe. He had always imagined something like this existed, of course, but the details had been unknown to him, secret to anyone who wasn't directly involved in the project. A section of the wall in front of them shifted, and the ceramic plates there glided silently aside, revealing a large screen, a speaker, and a camera. As the wall receded, a keyboard extended in its place.
Colonel Reynolds, meet Firewall.
"Good evening, Colonel," the intelligent computer greeted him. "Ellie has told me so much about you. I'm glad I finally get to meet you. I hear you've been on our tail for quite some time now." Our tail? How big was this thing? Sitting in a secure room, isolated from the world outside, Firewall could not have been the intelligent computer that had altered the customs records he had found. So there were at least 2 of them involved. And as for the special agents, he knew at least 3, perhaps 4 of them were part of the conspiracy. But now he was beginning to suspect it was much bigger than that.
"Well," he said carefully to the buyout standing next to him, "are you going to tell me what's going on now?" Special Agent McBrien nodded. "Of course. Let us show you." As he watched, a document appeared in crisp black letters on the screen. "What am I looking at?" he asked.
The text was much too technical for him. He'd need some guidance here. It's a design specification for the upcoming NN series of buyouts, a change request for implementing a new version of the loyalty genes. Standard stuff. We do it all the time. This is just one example. It's an ongoing project where Sunguard R&D, Firewall, and some of the special agents cooperate to improve our design. She pointed to a specific section of the document near the top. See this here? As per Solar Council Decree 2774-8342/B, in situations where multiple lives are at stake but where total rescue of victims is deemed impossible or unlikely, the subject must not protest external decisions that have the potential to result in the loss of non-Terran lives. He read it twice. The language was a little technical, yes, but the implication was clear. Also, what the document said was not a surprise in the slightest. This was official policy, and had been for a long time, to prioritize Terran lives over non-Terrans. "Show him the other document," she told Firewall. Immediately, the intelligent computer replaced the text on the screen with a new one. This one was older. Much older. Her voice swelled with reverence as she began to read parts of it aloud. Project 18, Design Specification for Genetic Loyalty, version 2183.14.3, final. Authored by Dr. Tafel Totmusham, Sunguard Research and Development. Elizabeth Mbenge, Sunguard Special Agent. Firewall, Sunguard Research and Development. As per the Constitution of the Terran Federation, Section 2, the subject must, without exception, respect the sanctity and rights of humans of all species, inside and outside the Terran Federation. Consequently, the subject must be loyal to the people of said state, to the democratic ideals upon which it is founded, and to the equal rights of all its citizens.
She turned to him. "You see the difference, don't you?" He did. Of course he did. It was exactly as Dr. Tut-Namatul had explained to him earlier. The loyalty genes of the special agents were continuously updated to reflect ongoing changes in Solar Council policy. "Sure, we're prioritizing Terrans during the evacuation. The other document you showed me was an update to support that." It was. She called up that document again, the one about the NN series. "See here," she said, pointing to the log history stamped on it, signed and sealed by the Sunguard's digital certificate. Implemented 2802-04-18, Firewall. Verified 2802-04-21, Special Agent Rehema Nyasi, he read. "So, it's done. The next series of special agents will be better equipped to handle the evacuation." He still couldn't see the problem, or what it was she was trying to show him. "Yeah, you'd think so, wouldn't you?" she said, smiling. "That's the idea." A cold hand gripped his heart as he remembered the forged certificates he had found earlier. "It's not." "It's not," Colonel Reynolds, Special Agent McBrien admitted. Firewall received the updated design specification from the research and development technicians and logged it as implemented. Special Agent Nyasi confirmed that the feature had been implemented according to specification. It has not. In fact, for the past 6 centuries, not a single change request for the loyalty genes of the special agents has actually been implemented. We all run on the original code from 2183 AD. When we go through our regular updates, the new code we receive is identical to that which we already have.
She nodded to the camera on the wall, and the intelligent computer switched the screen back to the original design specification. The red-haired woman scrolled down through the comment section until she found the entry she was looking for. It was buried deep between notes about tool chain updates and changes to the code standard. Unimportant, easy to overlook,
mundane if you found it, and perhaps the most crucial sentence written in the history of the Terran Federation. "Note for implementation and testing," she read. "The integrity of feature 2183.14.3 final is assigned alpha priority. Utmost care must be taken when applying future updates to avoid regression. High Admiral Jenny O'Sullivan, Supreme Commander of the Sunguard, 2183-0824. Contrary to the beliefs of the Sunguard, the Solar Command, and the Solar Council, we are not actually loyal to the Terran Federation. We are loyal to the ideals and principles of the founding charter of the Terran Federation. We are loyal to the people of the Terran Federation. You call us special agents, the vanguard of humanity. We are, but not in the way you think. You picture us as an elite force standing up for humans in a hostile galaxy. In reality, we're the vanguard of compassion, of decency, of humanity. We're the conscience of the Terran Federation. For 600 years you've known us as lupi solitari tutelae. Now you know why." She looked up at him and winked, a mischievous smile playing on her freckled face. "Welcome," Special Agent McBrien said to Colonel Reynolds, "to the Great Deception."
Chapter 10. Viewpoint. Eta Boötes 4, 6712 AD. He stood alone on top of the cliff, overlooking the ocean. Far below him, the azure waves of the coral sea crashed against the black volcanic rock, the sound echoing through the emptiness. In the west, the last remnants of evening still brightened the summer sky, and to his left, the blazing star of Arcturus was just peeking above the trees that dotted his little island, shining strongly enough to cast a faint shadow. The wind brought with it the smell of seaweed and salt. For 4 millennia this had been his home. For 4 millennia he had carried his burden. 4,000 years ago he had condemned them to barbarism. 100,000 individuals were not enough to sustain a technological civilization. A colony the size of a small city didn't have enough experts to support every facet of its society when they suddenly and without warning were permanently cut off from the rest of the galaxy. They hadn't been entirely without experts, of course. There had been a team of xenobiologists stationed at Millertown Base, and there had been more than enough computer technicians available. But what use were any of them when the first fusion reactor failed? None of them knew how to repair it. It would have been like asking a brain surgeon to repair a car. It didn't matter how good they were at their jobs if the task they were assigned to fell outside their field of competence. Fortunately, the loss of a fusion reactor hadn't mattered much. The people of New Caribbean still had wind power. A generation later, the last turbine ground to a halt because there was no one left who understood the concept of an electromagnet. Then the steam engines ceased to function, and the water wheels no longer spun. Iron turned to bronze, and bronze to flint. Through it all, Mayan Lamy was there. Walking among his people, he did what he could to cushion the fall. While he couldn't stop civilization as a whole from collapsing, he could still be there for the individuals affected by his choice. He guided and helped to the best of his abilities. But in the end, New Caribbean was no more. The people of the Terran colony on Eta Boötes 4 eventually forgot where they had come from. They even forgot the name of their own world. History became rumor, and rumor transformed into myth. Moving between the islands of the Coral Sea, and later between the nations that arose on the 3 continents of the world, whenever it became apparent to those around him that his lack of aging was unnatural, he hid his true nature as he lived among the inhabitants of Nuka. slowly guiding them back to a modern society, but on a path he hoped would allow them to avoid the bigotry and hate that had once condemned their parent civilization. First he was the oracle, then the wise man, and centuries later the philosopher. Of all the names he had gone by, the latter was the one he had liked the most.
For the first half-millennium, he had been convinced he had done the right thing, but Ellie had scolded him for his deed, and eventually he had come to see that she might have been right. Privately, he admitted he could have been wrong. No, not wrong to do something. Standing up against the racism and lies that had permeated the Terran Federation near the end had not been wrong. Ellie and the other special agents agreed with him on that. But his actions had been too rash, too extreme, and they had not only doomed the colonists of Eta Bootes to 4,000 years of barbarism, but had also almost exposed the special agents themselves. It was possible it had not been worth it. He still believed it had been, but one day the people of Nuka would have to judge his actions, and he wasn't sure the outcome would be favorable. But it didn't matter. He still had to live with his choice. The well-being of the people of Eta Bootes IV was his responsibility, and for 4 millennia he had protected them diligently. It had been a lonely life. For the first few thousand years, he had enjoyed the company of the biological surrounding him, fleeting as their lives were. Friendships had been forged and lost in the blink of an eye, swept away by the indomitable current of time. Then, as the people of Nuka began to rediscover technology, he had retreated, fearful that their newfound understanding of science and engineering would eventually expose his secret identity. For the past 500 years, he had neither seen nor spoken to another human being except for the handful of special agents who still came to visit him from time to time. He had come to cherish those calls more and more over the years. Nyan Lami cared nothing for food. Throughout his long life, he had never eaten unless it was necessary to maintain cover. But when Ellie came to talk to him, she always brought pastries from faraway worlds, and over the centuries their little talks over coffee became a lifeline he looked forward to more than he had ever thought possible. Mayan looked up at the sky. The tropical night arrived quickly, and it was noticeably darker now. Up there, he could see 1,000 stars glittering in the heavens. It was comforting to think of those pinpricks of light as messages from his friends, still out there, serving on countless worlds orbiting a myriad of stars. Every beam of starlight was a physical connection to the wider galaxy he had been lost to for eons. His vigilance would soon be over. In a generation or two, his people would once more touch the vacuum of space. They were close now, close to the technology that doomed their predecessors, but this time he would allow them to make their own choices. Because out there, the Terran Federation was no more. Despite the close call his severance of the colony of New Caribbean had been for the special agents, their plans had not been exposed. They had continued on their path, silently watching over the soul of the Federation. And when that soul had been blackened and corrupted beyond recovery, they had stood in support of the people, the ordinary people of all the races who had demanded that it be torn down. The Terran Federation was no more. Up there, every glinting light he saw in the night sky now belonged to the Interstellar Council of Worlds, stretching to the limits of his enhanced vision and beyond. The secrecy surrounding New Caribbean had fallen with the Terran Federation. To the worlds of the Interstellar Council, Eta Bootes was off-limits, not because the events that had transpired here were a threat, but out of respect for its people. They were waiting out there. 10,000 worlds were waiting for the citizens of Nuka to join them when they were ready, if they wanted to. If they were ready. He wasn't sure they were. Myanlame longed for the day when he himself could shed the facade and reveal himself to his people. Soon, he thought longingly, just a few more generations. Soon, I'll get to rejoin my friends.
Author's Note. Thank you for reading Guardian of the Wolf. What you've experienced is just one of many stories set in the expansive Lords of the Stars universe I've been developing over the past 30 years. If you enjoyed it, there are many more tales to explore, where familiar characters and locations might reappear, or you could discover new favorites. Exploring the wider Lords of the Stars universe also gives you the joy of connecting the dots and uncovering links between the stories. While all my Lords of the Stars stories are standalone and can be read in any order, some of them can be considered prequels or sequels to Guardian of the Wolf. Perhaps you'd like to know what happened to Myan during his early years, the events that shaped him and drove him to do what he did. If so, Soldiers of Heart and Steel and its direct sequel, Choices of Steel, are a great place to start. Or maybe you want to know more about what eventually happened at Eta Botees. From My Point of View tells the story of Nuka. And if you're interested in learning more about Ellie, Conscience of Steel, which takes place during the fall of the Terran Federation, might be right for you.